you all are here today. I'm going to go ahead and get started so we don't get too far behind schedule. So yes, I'm Dr. Panxhi, and I'm going to talk for about the first 20 minutes of our breakout session about Beowulf and Percival, and Dr. Newsom is going to talk the second 20 minutes about the Divine Comedy, and then we'll have time, hopefully about 10 minutes at the end, for questions and answers. So as you listen, write down questions, things you would like us to elaborate on or follow up on. I am curious though, how many of you all teach or have taught Beowulf at some point? Yes? Oh, look how many hands. Excellent. How many of you teach or have taught Percival, the story of the Grail, at some point? Only one or two of you. Okay, that is what I expected. And so what I decided to do today is I'll spend more of my time on Beowulf, and I'm going to offer 5 approaches to teaching Beowulf, just ideas that you can bring into your classroom maybe as a new, fresh, fun approach. Many of you, I'm sure, do some of these things already, and you may have great suggestions to offer to us in the Q&A time of other neat things you do in your courses. Beowulf is such a rich text. I've had the privilege of translating it in my doctoral studies. I've spent semesters pouring through it, so it's really hard to talk in any short amount of time, right? The same goes for Percival. I did part of my dissertation chapter on that. I love it. Again, I could talk about it for hours. So I'm going to focus on Beowulf as a useful thing for you in your classrooms, and then sort of give you reasons why you might want to consider teaching Percival in the future. So, to begin with, if you're choosing a translation of Beowulf, I do recommend Seamus Heaney's translation. He's the amazing Irish poet, Nobel laureate. And of the modern translations out there, his is my favorite. But as I teach, I also love to help students connect to the original Old English the poem's written in, right? They have to read in translation, but I don't want them to forget the history, language, and rich culture that's at the root of this. So my first suggestion as an approach as you teach Beowulf is to use the text as a gateway to awaken curiosity about the history of the English language. Because many students haven't really paused to think about this. So I'll ask them a question, like, if you traveled back to the time of Christ and spoke English, could anyone in the world understand you? Would anyone know what you were saying? Would you have anyone who spoke the same language? The answer would be no, right? At that point in time, English did not yet exist. So then hopefully that raises a question in their minds. Hold on then, when and where did the language we think, write, speak in start to exist? And so just having them start to enjoy and think through the process of communication language. Of course, a little bit of information on Old English. Another term for it is Anglo-Saxon. And those Angles and Saxons were invading England in the 5th to 7th centuries AD. They're, of course, Germanic tribes. They spoke dialects of the Germanic language. And so it was in England those dialects blended and became what we call Anglo-Saxon, right? I like to point out to the students there are several letters in Old English that we no longer use. The whin, the thorn, the ash, the eth, and the yod. Although we do often see the ash in the words like encyclopedia, right? It still carries over in some places. And so I remind them, as far as history of the English language, Old English was spoken from that time the Angles and Saxons invade up through the time of the Norman conquest in 1066. And then, of course, it continues to be spoken by the lower classes, but rulers use French, and that's where we start getting the beginnings of Middle English, right? The borrowing of the French and Latin loanwords into Old English and the blending of those. So we emerge with Middle English in Chaucer's age. So just a fun little gateway into history of English language for our students. I also like to show them the first 3 lines of Beowulf in Old English, along with this is an image of the one single surviving Beowulf manuscript. It's not a fancy or beautiful manuscript as far as medieval texts go. There are far more ornate, gorgeous medieval manuscripts, but we're so thankful this one survived. So I'll often have students try to read aloud a line, and they'll have fun stumbling over, like, what do we do with that weird alphabet letter? Oh, in that one. So there's a whin and an ash in the first line, a thorn in the second. And so they'll have fun, and then I'll read for them and ask them to try and see it in the manuscript. What we gardenain year daglum theod kuniga fremje frunan hotha athalinga selen fremedon, right? That doesn't sound much like our modern English. But when I have time, I go through pointing out the letters in the manuscript, but we don't have time for that now. Another thing I like to introduce to them is this short little passage. And I'm going to read some of it, not all. And as I read it, you all tell me if you can recognize what it is. Father ure, thu the ert on helvenum, si thim nama yahalgod, to bekumathin richa, Yewerdathin wila, on eorthan swaswa on heovenum, Urnege dai honikan flaf, Suleas to die, and forgive us urigiltas, Swaswa way forgive us urum iltendum. I'm sure you all recognize this is the Lord's Prayer, right? And so I use this to show students, even though our pronunciation and the grammar have changed dramatically from Old English to now, still about 70% of our modern spoken English vocabulary comes from the Old English, and you can see that in these words. Father, heovenum, heaven, on eorthan swaswa on heovenum, on earth as it is in heaven. I love that swaswa. It's a great Old English word for just as. Fun. So this is just to give them a glimpse. If you all are interested, I gave a YouTube link. There's a good reading of this on YouTube if you feel like you wouldn't want to read it aloud yourself. And I'm also happy to share this PowerPoint and any material with you afterwards. I'll be happy to give you my email and share this if it's helpful. So that's my first approach. Second, I would suggest connecting with the material culture of Great Britain. I've had the privilege to go several times to the British Museum, and I always take pictures in the Old English, the Sutton Hoo Gallery, to share with my students. And I just wanted you all to, I'm sure, how many of you have been to England, been able to go to the British Museum? So yeah, many of you probably have been in the Sutton Hoo Gallery yourselves, but what's exciting is they have really upped their game on the British Museum website. I don't know if you're aware, but you can go tour gallery by gallery virtually. So the gallery I like to point my students towards related to the opening of Beowulf is the famous Sutton Hoo ship burial. And so we'll read and discuss those opening lines of Beowulf, which are about a ship burial, sending a good king out to sea in his ship. And then I'll tell them about the time in 1939 when a woman who had an interest in archaeology and owned land in Sutton Hoo noticed, I've got 18 strange mounds on my land. They don't seem naturally formed. So she convinced local archaeologists and eventually someone from the British Museum to come dig inside of these mounds. And within the largest of the mounds, they uncovered a 27-meter long ship that had been buried, right? And in the center of that was a hoard of treasure. So probably to honor, they don't know, it's still a mystery to this day who this was. I'm guessing an early Anglo-Saxon king. But what's amazing about this woman, Edith Pretty, she donated the entire discovery to the British Museum. And so there's a gallery, a Sutton Hoo gallery. Probably the most famous object is the Sutton Hoo helmet that's in ruins, but still you can see the dragons over the eyebrows, the dragon coming down the helm, the little glittering red ruby eyes. And then they've recreated the helmet as they think it might have looked in its glory days, down to the wonderful little gold mustache. I love that. So I often ask students, if you were in battle in Anglo-Saxon England and saw a warrior coming charging towards you, waving a sword and wearing this helmet, what would you do? And like, usually then they don't think the mustache is so laughable. It's like, that could be pretty terrifying and intimidating. But of course, this helmet may also have been more ornamental and status symbol. It's got images of warlike scenes in battle, possibly from myth, legend, or the deeds of this actual king on the helmet itself, right? So those are just some of the things. This whole gallery is really neat. They also have an area with torques. Beowulf, we'll talk about. He is given a gift after fighting Grendel of the most resplendent torque of gold I've ever heard tell of. So I show them an image of the great torque of Snedisham, which these were used as a neck adornment, right? And then often cloaks, they think, were tied and fastened around the torque. I wish we could bring torques back in our fashion today. I would wear them. They're excellent. And there's just dozens and dozens of them in the British Museum. And then lastly, swords. Of course, those swords are very central in Beowulf. Interestingly, he always breaks them, right? Because he's too strong for swords. His body's his weapon, right? But swords are the most important status symbol of the Anglo-Saxon warrior. Pattern welding is the feature of how they made them. There's a neat video on the British Museum website that talks about that. So if we have time at the end, I'll just switch and show you the British Museum website where you can just hit virtual tour and it takes you to a Google Street Maps type view of the gallery and you can just click around and move. So that might be a neat thing to have your students do as homework. Go explore the gallery some, look at the artifacts, get a sense that this isn't just a poem on a page. These are lived lives and reflecting the epic, past of English history. A third approach would be discussing Germanic virtues and Beowulf's heroism. So Tacitus, earlier writer, talking about the virtues of the Germanic tribes, focuses on their valor, bravery in battle, loyalty to one's lord, one's family, one's warband, and one's god or gods, and then generosity and gift-giving. all of these virtues are embodied and presented throughout the text of Beowulf. So having students look for those moments and episodes and seeing those enacted. I also like to tie this to the question of Beowulf's heroism. So looking at what Germanic virtues does Beowulf himself display, and then considering, is he meant to be an ideal hero, sort of portraying the Germanic virtues, or is he a flawed hero brought down by his pride and thirst for glory? There's tension in the text, so having students lean into that and see both the strengths and possible weaknesses in Beowulf. What flaws does he have, if any? We talk about the way his own people, the Geats, viewed him. He was without respect and status when he left to fight Grendel, and that's a strange and interesting detail of his backstory, right? So he seems to be a sort of a hero that emerges over time, but doesn't begin with status and respect. And then I asked them at the end, the final battle with the dragon, where decades go by. So another interesting question in Beowulf is, what happens when a hero ages, right? Usually we see heroes in their strength and their glory and going into combat with their power, but when 50 years pass and the hero is near death and another foe arises, like a dragon, what is the hero's role then when he's older and weaker? Is it right for Beowulf, as a king now and a leader, to go to fight the dragon alone? Should he have sent his younger heroes, warband in? So talking through those sort of tensions and questions. A fourth approach, I really enjoy integrating faith into everything I teach. And so considering Beowulf as a Christian poem, we don't know the author. It would be amazing if we did. But they're very likely a monk. And so a little history of the time, I remind students, Anglo-Saxons had converted to Christianity by the 7th century. And Beowulf is set in the 5th century when Germanic warriors were still pagan. But the poet is writing post-Christianization. And so there are biblical references built in. Interestingly, every biblical reference that is explicitly mentioned is from the Old Testament. No New Testament mentions of Christ, any apostles, any of that. That's interesting in itself. Also, every time the name of God is mentioned, the poet uses a name that Anglo-Saxons used for their pagan deities, but then begin to use to refer to the Christian God. So the poet seems to be wanting to walk this line, saying, I am going to honor and remember the pagan heroic past, but also we're writing in a Christian present. And so he's acknowledging the nature of the past he's writing towards, and then the present he's living in, and walking that line in really interesting ways. And as you probably know, there's much scholarship and debate over these aspects. I also like to point out to students, Beowulf can be seen as a Christ figure, because he is going to face the dragon, the serpent, Satan possibly, and he's accompanied by 12 thanes, loyal followers, most of whom abandon him. 11 of the 12 run away and abandon him, and one stays by his side, Wiglaf, right, to fight with him. So much like the 12 disciples abandon him, but then John's there at the foot of the cross. So I suggest that even though the poet doesn't explicitly mention New Testament references, you might expect readers to see that allegory and resonate with that as they hear the story of Beowulf. Also interesting to see multivalent options for allegorical interpretation. Beowulf could also maybe be seen as a Samson-type figure, strong but arrogant, right? That there is too much strength and confidence in his own power and abilities in his body, and that's part of what leads to his downfall. But he does destroy evil as he brings, the downfall about. So just a lot of different ways to consider Christian aspects and resonances within the text. It's good for reading and conversation as well. And then fifth, final approach. I came to medieval studies because of my own love for Lewis and Tolkien throughout my life, and so probably many of you share this affection. So I always enjoy cultivating that link to modern fantasy, talking about how Tolkien's The Hobbit, its plot is very much inspired by the dragon episode within Beowulf, right? The idea of a small thief who creeps into a dragon's lair and steals a golden goblet, and then comes back out and awakens the wrath of the dragon, who comes and destroys Beowulf's hall. Tolkien is an Anglo-Saxon scholar himself, right? And as many of you probably know, there is a translation he did of Beowulf. It wasn't published during his lifetime, but edited by his son and published after his death. I think if he'd had more time to edit it himself, it could be even better. Still, if I have to weigh them, I like Seamus Heaney's translation better. But Tolkien absolutely knew and loved Anglo-Saxon heritage, language, culture, inside and out. And so when he hears of that small thief sneaking in to steal a golden goblet, he creates a hobbit, right? This small little hobbit who sneaks in, steals the same thing, golden cup, and awakens the wrath of Smaug, right? So for students, it can be fun to read The Hobbit maybe alongside Beowulf, compare those. And then also, of course, if you can get them into the trilogy, which is even better, Tolkien's Riders of Rohan are very much modeled off the Anglo-Saxons in so many ways. In fact, King Theoden, right? That name Theoden means Lord or King in Old English, so he's named King, essentially. Many of the Old English words show up in Rohan's culture. So that's a few different angles, approaches on Beowulf. And then for Percival, this is written by Crytean XII. We do know the author, though we don't know much about him. It's written in the High Middle Ages, the 12th century. And this is, in many ways, one of the funniest medieval texts you could ever read. Okay, so this is sort of my 5 reasons why you might want to consider teaching Percival. First of all, it is hilarious. So even though it's written in that High Middle Ages, it has the sort of feel of an original Princess Bride or Monty Python. It's just got these hilarious moments and episodes and dialogue, and it was probably performed aloud in the Anglo-Norman court, and so you can see it's made for laughs, so the people are enjoying it, engaging. But then what the poet also does is he entwines more serious Christian themes as well, so it has more depth even than something like, Princess Bride or Monty Python. So it's a really great text to teach. We have included it in our Western Civ curriculum here at OBU in the last few years, and students love it. It's often the text they choose to write their research paper about, and there's just a lot of resonance and enthusiasm for it. Its main character is a selfish teenage boy who wants to become a knight. So again, for high schoolers, so you can identify with this sort of the character. And also, it's interesting to parallel. Percival is sort of the original Luke Skywalker. Boy he's in the Welsh countryside in the wastelands, just like Luke's on Tatooine. And then Luke wants to become a Jedi Knight. Percival wants to train to be a knight of Arthur's court. And they make a lot of mistakes along the way, but eventually end up, doing some good. So there's just a lot of fun resonances. George Lucas studied the hero's journey, was familiar with the story of Percival as he created Star Wars, so the links are clear there. A few other reasons to teach Percival. It focuses on Percival's journey to learn to understand and demonstrate charity. And that's used in the original Christian sense of, the sense of Christian love. And in the opening, in fact, the prologue, which is sort of Crytean addressing his patron, he mentions charity 5 times. So he seems to be saying charity, love, is going to be a big theme throughout. And in the earlier parts of the text, it's very much about Percival's total failure to show charity to anyone around him. He's remarkably selfish and callous and causes a lot of damage through that selfishness. But as the text goes on, he begins to show these moments of compassion and care. So it's a neat text to consider, again, Christian virtue alongside adventure and heroism. Fourth, Crytean is the original Grail quest author. He invented the quest for the Holy Grail, okay? And this will agonize you and your students. I hate to tell you this, it is unfinished. We don't know if either his patron died, so he wasn't going to get paid, or if Crytean himself died. It is his last romance that he wrote. So that it cuts off at this really evocative moment where Percival has just repented and taken communion and sort of restored his relationship with God after 5 years. And then it ends, and the poet says, I'll come back to Percival in a little bit, and I'll tell you about Gawain's adventures now for all. Never comes back to Percival, because it's unfinished. And that seems like the worst possible outcome, but actually in many ways it was good for the Grail quest. It created this immense curiosity amongst medieval readers, and so they start writing medieval continuations, the French Vulgate cycle, etc. So there's all the Grail quest becomes so huge, I think in large part because it intrigued people, and there wasn't an answer, and it wasn't resolved, and so all these later medieval authors wrote what we could call medieval fan fiction, but they continue writing stories of the Grail quest to tell and complete that. And I do also like to link Percival to more modern literature, right? It can serve as a great foundation if students are later going to study works like Mallory's Morte d'Arthur, Spencer's The Fairy Queen, Eliot's The Wasteland even has a lot of Grail, Fisher King references. Cormac McCarthy's The Road also uses a lot of Grail sort of imagery. So if students are familiar with the original early Grail quest, I think that'll enrich a lot of their readings and later texts as well. And also hopefully just get them into Arthurian legend in a fun way. So that's what I have, and now I'm gonna switch. I need to switch PowerPoints here for a minute and get Dr. Newsom's PowerPoint out. So we'll take a second here.
While Dr. Panxhi is navigating, I'm going to ask the same kind of question at the outset. And I'm going to start not by presuming that necessarily all of us have read the Divine Comedy at all. So if this is new to you, if you've not only not taught it, but not read it, do we have any newbies who are just interested in Dante for the first time? Okay, good. How many of you have taught the Divine Comedy or portions of it, at least in class? Okay, a few of you. Is there anyone who teaches the whole poem? Okay, good. That was one of the questions. Thinking about how to approach these breakout sessions where we're trying to, I think, share as much as we can about texts that have so very much to offer. Dante's Divine Comedy is in many ways the literary pinnacle, if not the artistic pinnacle, of the Middle Ages. And so there is always a challenge when teaching this text, the challenge of selection and focus, and when we teach Dante in our sophomore level course, it's a survey course, so we only have 6 days on it, and it never feels like enough. So I'm curious, from those of you who teach portions of it, how do you just do an Inferno, or do you select others from across the text? Yeah. Good. Anyone else? Same. That's probably the most common. So what I'm going to try to do in the next 15-20 minutes, and then leave some time for discussion, is give a basic framework that can maybe help you think through if you were to teach this for the first time, or if you've been teaching it, how might you supplement that Inferno piece and enrich your students' understanding of the whole poem. And if it's new to you entirely, I hope you get at least an overall sense of this work. Dante, by the way, he didn't call it the Divine Comedy. He just called it the comedy, his comedy, which meant it sort of had a glorious ending. It's sort of a pilgrimage toward God that concludes in the third section, Paradiso, with a beatific vision of God. So the whole poem is about finding union with divine love, with God's love. It was later readers who added the divine part because it's divine love. Right? So it'd be fairly audacious to title your own work divine. Later readers did that. This quote, a couple of quotes from John Ciardi, who's one of the translators of the Divine Comedy, one of many who have done a translation. I feel a little bit of sucker when I read this and teach it every year. It's an old story of a retired OBU faculty member who had taught in our Western Civ courses for 35 years or something, and going into his last year, he said, I've got one more chance to get the Divine Comedy right. Ciardi says the supreme art of poetry is not to assert meaning, but to release it. And that's certainly what Dante's allegory does. He's not outright asserting propositional truths like we might expect in an essay, where here's my thesis, here's what the poem's arguing. So it requires an active and alert and open kind of readership to be sensitive to what Dante might release, what truths, what meanings might be opened up by the poem. Ciardi also says no one can ever finish reading the Divine Comedy. There will always be a new way of viewing the elements, but if no one can finish the poem, anyone can begin it and be the richer for having begun. So if you're a newbie, great, you can jump into this poem and really gain a lot. If you're an experienced Dante reader and teacher, you probably already know that there's sort of perpetual riches to be gained each time we go back. Now, this is a poem in 3 parts. It's a grand epic poem that Dante took a very deliberate sort of approach to structuring. And there's a lot of information you can find on good websites and some of the supporting resources I'm going to point you to that may explain in more minute detail the structure of the poem. 100 cantos, these 3 parts, each one having 33, kind of the numerology of that structure
bears a kind of significance pointing to the Trinity most often, but other theories exist on, why the round number of 100, right? Oh, this captures something of a sense of wholeness or perfection that he's trying to illustrate. But the three parts are Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. And the timeline of the poem, it begins, Dante, the poet, is also sort of, there's a Dante the pilgrim, the character making his way on this journey is named Dante. So there's a tension there between the writer and the figure. At the beginning of or midway through our life's journey, I awoke in a dark wood. That's how the poem opens. How did I wind up lost in darkness? We learn later in the poem also that this happens to be Good Friday of Easter weekend, and Dante is going to be led on a pilgrimage first down through the Inferno, through hell, to see souls in torment, souls who have chosen sin rather than divine love, who have been offered grace but not taken advantage of it, have instead been misled toward love of wrong things and not partaking God's grace when offered. There is a whole lot of fun and grotesque kind of stuff you will see on that journey through hell. There's certainly some that is shocking to students, how vulgar or bodily Dante's imagination is. And it seems kind of gross sometimes. There's also a lot of sophomoric humor that comes out in that, with flatulence being used to sound a trumpet, for example. I mean, high school boys ought to have a great field day with some of these cantos. And it's easy to kind of have this sense of, how is this a Christian poem? This is disgusting, right? What's going on here? And particularly if, due to time constraints, you're sort of focusing only on Inferno. That's what your students are getting, just the ugly parts, right? Kind of the unseemly consequences of sin that Dante the Pilgrim sees as he descends lower and lower. That's really important, though, because it is showing Dante the Pilgrim the depths of human sin. It's as if through the poem, Dante's saying, here's what we're really doing when we wallow in sin, right? When we give ourselves over to pride or to wrath or to lust, or in the lowest depths to fraud, when we sort of deceive those who trust us, we betray them. He creates allegorical pictures of the destructive consequences of those sins. So that's a really valuable lesson for all of us, an important theological point too. St. Augustine said, you must descend with Christ in order to ascend, and then ascend to God. And that's the motion that Dante is taking in the poem. Descend through hell with sin, and then emerge, climb in the second canticle of the poem up Mount Purgatory. There's all kinds of questions that arise immediately, especially if you're from a Protestant background, about the doctrine of purgatory or the reality of purgatory. Does Dante really, believe this is what the afterlife is like? It's helpful perhaps to root our teaching of the poem in that allegorical genre. We don't necessarily have to agree theologically with whether there is an actual purgatory in the afterlife. We don't have to decide necessarily if there is an actual purgatory in the afterlife to gain from the poem. It's dramatizing the putting off sin and replacing it with virtue, the path of sanctification that all Christians are called to. So I think it's really valuable to include at least some portions of Purgatory, or at least to help your students know that Dante's work is not all about hell. That's not all there is. No, there's much more there, and part of it is an illustration of how we rid ourselves of vice and acquire virtues. And that's something that all Christians are called to do in this life. So it's as much about this life and how we live the life of faith now as about anything in the afterlife. The third canticle is Paradise, the Paradiso, when Dante allegorically ascends to the heavens, the outer heavens where God dwells, and experiences most fully God's presence, led by Beatrice. So that is probably the least frequently taught canticle, but it's important, at least for students, to know that's where the poem leads, right? Its whole trajectory is to guide Dante toward union with God, union with divine love in its purest form. Getting that into a poem representing that, Dante the poet says outright in Paradiso, this is an impossible task, right? How do I put into words what this experience would be like? And yet, out of a sense of love and artistic duty, he's trying for his audience to illustrate what that is. That progression, I mentioned the poem starts at Good Friday. There's obviously a kind of significance to that association with Holy Week, right? The crucifixion of Christ, the bearing of sin, right, corresponding with this descent to the inferno, but then the resurrection of Easter Sunday, which brings the possibility of salvation for Dante the Pilgrim and all of the saints that he encounters there, and also us as readers. One of the things that students find interesting, certainly, about studying Dante, this is going to be hard to see from where you're sitting, I realize, but Dante's sort of model of the universe, of the cosmos, plays an important part in the structure of the poem, and he's drawing, in some parts he's sort of inventing, but in other parts he's drawing on classical sources, the Ptolemaic model of the universe, particularly in Paradiso, when we get the spheres, concentric spheres of the heavens. What you see here is Earth in the middle. Dante's hell is sort of a cone shape to the very center of the earth. And in the closing cantos of Inferno, that's where he'll encounter Satan himself. There's a symbolic significance to that location, because in Dante's conception, the outermost realm, the Empyrean, the sort of outermost heaven, is where God dwells. It's as if God's enclosing all of his creation in one sense, right? He's wrapped himself around all that he has created. But in another sense, right, the further you go down into the depths of the Inferno, that's as far as you can get from that outermost realm. Dante emerges at the end of Inferno, beginning of Purgatorio, on the shores of Mount Purgatory, which he sort of figures as a mountain directly opposite the globe from Jerusalem. And then Purgatory is structured with 7 tiers or cornices, one for each of the 7 deadly sins, or in each one has its corresponding virtue. So the lowest is pride, and then it moves up from there. Sloth is in the middle, lust is at the top. So in each of those, the souls that are ascending Purgatory are charged with purging the stain of that sin from their souls, so that they will naturally arise toward God. One further thing to note about Dante and how this cosmology sort of intersects with his theology. the nature of humanity, our created being for Dante, is we are made for union with God. Right? He created us for this. So the soul naturally, if unweighed down by sin, unstained by sin, then the soul naturally will rise to God. And that's illustrated really beautifully throughout the Purgatorio as a soul sort of rises level by level. And then Dante and Beatrice at the beginning of Paradiso. There's this wonderful moment where they're sort of weightless, and Dante doesn't notice at first, but he's flying through the sky, through space, and ascending through the spheres. An image of the soul freed from sin, finding its natural place in God's presence. So there's a real beauty to that. Okay, a few teaching questions here that you must consider if you're going to teach Dante, or if you already teach Dante. How much? Touched on this already. Ideally, all of it. I've never gotten to teach all of it, and you may not either. If you've got standards you have to meet, or a broader curriculum you're trying to cover. So the question of selection comes up inevitably. Frequently, teachers will teach only the Inferno, and all of the Inferno. There's a good rationale for that, in that you're getting a sense of completion. You're getting, one full canticle of the three. But I would like to point you towards some selections if you're curious about incorporating a little bit of Purgatorio or a little bit of Paradiso into your teaching. I would recommend cantos 1 through 3 of Purgatorio, 17 and 18, and 30 to 33. A few reasons for that. The first 3 cantos give just kind of an introduction to this new realm and mark very starkly a contrast from what Dante witnessed in hell, the Inferno. It's utterly dark, right? The only light, there's light enough for him to see what's going on, but it's not real light, right? In Dante, light is always associated with God and with God's presence. So as he's descending into hell, there's darkness, there's the sound of screaming, there's grimy soot, or there's just filth. And as Dante shifts to Purgatory, it begins with this kind of moment of baptismal cleansing. He's directed to go down to the water's edge and wash that grime off of his face. And so that's a really vivid visual way for the students to see a contrast. All right, Purgatorio and Dante it's not sort of an extension of hell. It's a common misconception that people are atoning for their sins in some way. No, Christ atoned for their sins. If a soul is in Purgatory, in Dante's theology and structure, they are assured of their salvation. They are already saved. They're not earning their salvation, but they've died with the stain of sin still on their soul. And because we serve a transcendent, utterly holy God, in whose presence sin cannot stand, right? That sin has to be washed gradually. And how does that done? It's done by looking at good models. So each level of Purgatory presents a model of virtue. Always the Virgin Mary. A scriptural story from Mary's life is one of the illustrations of virtue. You also draw illustrations from classical literature or other biblical texts, like King David on the cornice of pride. He points to the Old Testament story of King David dancing with joy when the ark had been carried 6 steps and no one died. If you know that story, right? Touched the ark. They did it wrong the first time, the Israelites, when they tried to move the ark. And God's holiness was so great that someone was struck dead. Well, David was so overjoyed, even a king, right, became undignified enough to dance in front of his people. The model of humility that counteracts the vice of pride. So on each cornice, you get a biblical and a classical kind of model to follow, as well as a negative example. So who are the examples of pride that we want to avoid and cleanse ourselves of? So this would give you enough to kind of see that pattern emerging. 17 and 18. If you are really crunched for time and you say, I want to do something from Purgatory, but I can't necessarily fit all of that, the more I teach Dante, the more I am convinced that cantos 17 and 18 of Purgatorio are perhaps the most important part of the poem. They just enrich your understanding of the whole poem, because Dante appeals to his guide Virgil, the classical poet, talking about Virgil's Aeneid over in the other session. Virgil's been his guide all through Inferno and now in Purgatory, and they're on the cornice of sloth, and it starts to get dark, so they're going to rest there. Virgil explains why each cornice exists and where, essentially, where sin comes from, and how God, in his theology, very Augustinian theology, how God allows human will, right? How do our choices as humans sort of interact with God's love and the consequences of these choices? So 17 and 18, if we had like an hour, I might read selections of it. I will say this, if you do go this direction, it's really a great passage to have students try to diagram, right? It's very visual in some ways, right? You can kind of create a flow chart of Purgatorio, different sort of kinds of love. On the first three cornices, he'll say, are those who had misdirected love. They loved the wrong things, like in pride, we're loving ourselves. In sloth, the cornice of sloth, the vice of sloth, it's a lax love. We're not loving enough. And then in the higher cornices, you get up to gluttony, wrath, gluttony, sloth, I think, or lust at the top. Loving too much, right? Too excessive love of something that's good in itself, right? Gluttony, excessive love of food, sustenance, that's fine in itself. Or romantic love, sexual love, in the right context is a good thing God gives us, but lust is excessive, right? It's an excessive expression of that. So it's a really wonderful passage for understanding how all of Dante's understanding of God and humanity revolves around love. The Paradiso sections I would suggest for you to include cantos 1 through 3, again, kind of establish the universe of that canticle and Dante's beginning to ascend. And then 31 through 33. At least canto 33, at least the last parts of it. Let your students read Dante's very inadequate by his own measure, by his own account, attempt to say, here's what I experience imaginatively, united with God. I think having that passage, that goal in mind, even if you're concentrating mostly, spending the most time in Inferno, will enrich their understanding of the poem as a whole. As it relates to medieval theology, certainly, to Dante's own worldview, also as it relates to the life of the believer through the centuries down to us today, right? Our focus isn't on our sin, right? It shouldn't be entirely on our sin. Certainly shouldn't be entirely on ourselves. What we see is Dante eventually, his vision is directed in the right place. And he's enraptured by the light of God's presence. All right, so up to you to fit how much you can among those choices. The question of translation is always one that comes up when reading something written in another language. This is the translation that we use here at OBU commonly. It's by John Ciardi, the poet, American poet that I quoted from earlier. Alan Mandelbaum's translation is a little more recent. I think it was 1980. Both of them are quite readable, and they both try to maintain some of the verse structure of Dante's original poem. They can't quite reproduce the terza rima, which is a really complex rhyming scheme that Dante invented. The English language is not as rich in rhyme, and so it'd be really hard to do that. Ciardi I like a lot because for each tercet, the first and third line rhymes. We don't get the interlocking effect, but they're students, if you're wanting to also teach some formal elements, they can kind of grasp that. I would recommend you to avoid some of the older translations. They were good for their time. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow is one that's still around, and those translations are generally free. But I will say you can get Mandelbaum's translation for free online too. So if cost is a factor, you're not going to require them to purchase a book itself. Some of the websites I'm going to show you in a moment have Mandelbaum's. They have Longfellow's too, but Mandelbaum's. All right, so 3 great sites here, and then I'll try to leave a minute for any questions you might have. worldoftante.org, Dante Worlds, which is at the University of Texas, and then Digital Dante from Columbia University in New York. World of Dante, I think, is the oldest of this, and it kind of still shows on the site. Doesn't look as polished, but there's some really great multimedia stuff that you might use to help enrich students' understanding of Dante's time period or of the text as it developed. He's got that site has sacred music, for example, and in Purgatory and Paradiso in particular, there's lots of singing. I mentioned the sound of screams down in hell. In those early first canto of Purgatorio, you instead hear sort of an angel choir. And so World of Dante has some sacred music that's referenced in the poem. Lots of illustrations as well, a timeline of historical context, and their text of the poem has kind of hyperlinked notes that are helpful. So if you come across the name of a classical god or a classical beast or a biblical figure, and students may not know who it is, it can just pop up in the screen there. Dante Worlds has some of the same similar kinds of things, illustrations and some music. I find it most helpful for its commentary, sort of canto by canto. And then Digital Dante, if you have higher level students who are doing in-depth research, it seems a bit more advanced. It'd be great for college students, but if you're got juniors or seniors who are advanced and interested, it might be helpful too. One of the great things about preparing for this conference is I discovered a new resource that I thought, where has this been all my life? It turns out it's been around since 2009, so where have I been? Guy Raffa's The Complete Dante Worlds, A Reader's Guide to the Divine Comedy, is a super rich resource, and it corresponds to the Dante Worlds website. So it has some of that same commentary that you get online, but a bit more in terms of explanation. So I think that's all I've got. We can take 3-4 minutes here if you have questions. I do want to give you a little bit of time before we start our next session over in the big room. Is there anything you'd like to ask about Beowulf?
I'll let you all see the Sutton Hoo galleries. If you, it's not connected. Hold on. On the British, I just googled British Museum Sutton Hoo, so this would not be hard to find. But yeah, this is their sort of homepage about Sutton Hoo in Europe, and then to take a virtual tour, you just hit that to go to room 41, and then you end up in sort of Google Street View, and you can navigate around. So if I go here, we should be able to stand right in front of the Sutton Hoo helmet. Then you can just sort of wander around the gallery. So it's a neat moment and experience, and museums have given a lot more resources for free online since COVID, I think. And so this is just a neat thing to start showing students. And then I forgot to mention, but Burton Raffel is the one who translates Percival, and the translation I think is most accessible. And it's for sale on Amazon, sometimes a little hard to find, but that's what we use for our class, and it works well. It's also in the Norton Anthology. They have excerpts of Percival in there just by him. So, yeah, questions?
Do you have recommendations for teaching, I think especially Beowulf, but any of these texts in a public school, charter school setting? It's I'm in a very non-Christian setting.
Mm-hmm. So the question of how do you address Christian elements in a secular setting? that to me, because I also, during graduate school, you know, I was teaching these texts in my World Lit courses at a secular setting. Because the texts are so full of Christian references themselves, I feel like my job is to make sure students fully understand what are these references about, right? And so it doesn't have to come across as I am preaching my personal faith and trying to convert you, but an educated reader should be able to know and understand references and allegory to things like Beowulf possibly as a Christ figure or Samson figure. So explaining those things, I think it's a gateway to open the door towards conversation or at least knowledge of biblical references, which used to be, you know, part of everyone's education, Judeo-Christian background, and increasingly there's a lot of biblical illiteracy. So you could bring that in and very much, I guess it depends on your headmaster / teachers and how worried you'd be about backlash of, by bringing this up, will I get in trouble? But it should be so justified, right? These are references that are central to the meaning of the text. So, yeah.
I would say the same if you were trying to incorporate some of the Divine Comedy. Dante lived in a profoundly Christian time, right? The Christian church was the unifying force of the Middle Ages in Europe. Understanding not just that text, but the time period, you can't not talk about Christianity. So in the same way that Lindsey's talking about, explain a little bit of how Dante's worldview was formed by the rise of the Catholic Church and its growth. But and then you might let them sort of guide. Where do you need more? Are you confused about any of this? What questions do you have that you may be able to answer? That's a great question. Yeah, Michael.
Is there any formal scholarship on the relationship between the Divine Comedy and Lewis's Great Divorce, or even Willy Wonka, and how those might be parallels to help students access the Divine Comedy?
That is a great question. And Dr. Panxhi is more a Lewis scholar than I am, so you may know of things that I'm not aware of related to that.
Yeah, there are absolutely articles that have been written about sort of Lewis's understanding of heaven and eternity compared to Dante's understanding. Lewis is very well read and familiar with Dante, and so there are academic papers. In terms of teaching resources, I don't know of as much. It would almost be like the work of finding and reading some of those academic articles and then putting it at a level that is sort of lower shelf for the students. That'd be a challenge. Willy Wonka, I've never heard of a link there, so that may be an original idea you could elaborate on.
There's an article to be written, Michael.
Yes.